Hey everyone, we're back with another episode of Ask GN coming out of the AMD Ryzen event from earlier this week. And we've got another one coming up, so it's a lot of travel in about a 6-day period, and we've got benchmarking, of course, for Ryzen going on in between. Check back for the review once that's live. Don't jump up there. So the Ryzen question that I've seen a few places is about PCIe lanes. People keep asking how many PCIe Gen 3 lanes does it have for the GPU? We've answered this several times now, but I guess just to do it one more time, and maybe we'll put this in the title this time so it's more, it's easier for people to find. We've got a block diagram that we made earlier this month, or actually last month, just after CES. That diagram shows everything. Put that on the screen, I suppose. So you can see in the diagram, again, that we made, it's 16 PCIe 3.0 lanes off of the CPU going to the DGPU, and then those can be muxed, which is not special. There's just some boards have muxers on them, or PEX chips or PLX, and we've seen that with the MSI boards at CES and a couple of the other AM4 motherboards. But it's 16 lanes out of the CPU for the GPU. Then there are another 4 PCIe lanes going to the chipset. That's X370, B350, etc. And then that splits into your PCIe Gen 2 general purpose or your USB 3 lanes. And there are also PCIe Gen 3 lanes that act as I/O, and those go into other devices, which again we've got in this block diagram. You can see the 3 choices. It's a pick one scenario, so A, B, or C. You can pick those. That is the PCIe lane setup on Ryzen. It's nothing crazy. As far as strictly GPU, again, 16 lanes out of the CPU itself, which is sort of an SoC at this point, and then the rest is just the usual I/O lane assignment if you want to run M.2 devices via PCIe rather than SATA. So that hopefully answers the question. It's very simple. If you wanted to run one X16 card, you could. If you wanted to run 2x8, you could. Or you could start muxing and go down as desired depending on the motherboard and the support for the board. Next question is from Surpuppa, who says, question for next Ask GN, are delta temperatures affected by room temperature more than just subtraction? For example, if the air is 20 degrees and the CPU is at 50, the delta is at 30 as usual, but if the air is 30, would the CPU then run at 60 or would it be hotter? So this is a really good question. This is basically asking, is temperature, when you're using delta T, going to be a linear scale? And the answer is it depends. Now, we use delta T for a few reasons. One of them is because the fluctuation is normally so small that any nonlinear scaling is kind of irrelevant. It tends to be within a degree or so with a lot of our tests, if that, depending on kind of which room they were running and what coolers were used and things like that. But as for answering the question, I ended up reaching out to VSG from Thermal Bench. And VSG I've worked with for a while now on kind of validating externally some of our thoughts and our test methods. He runs Thermal Bench. He, as I understand it, is some form of postdoctorate researcher, does a ton of work with thermal equipment that plenty of folks don't have access to. So the guy is definitely credentialed to answer. So I asked, and the answer was I'll read through it here. If the thermal resistivity of the die or package is a linear function also, then sure, it would be linear. With older CPUs, and he says even up to 22 nanometers, it was mostly fine, meaning mostly a linear scaling between ambient and the IHS or whatever might be measured. VSG then said, I did a test of my 4770K with no heat load in my hotbox and just varied the hotbox ambient temperature from 25 to 80 Celsius in increments of 2 Celsius at a time. He then mapped the average CPU core temperature, and the increase in the average core temperature was nearly the same as the increase in the ambient temperature after steady state was reached, which admittedly took a few hours at times. And then VSG also says, I had a thermistor in contact with the IHS, and the increase in IHS temps was not the same, even with steady state accounted for. The slope of increase was higher for the IHS than the CPU cores, but the IHS slope of increase was, but the IHS varied between 1.4 Celsius increase to 2.2 or 2.4 Celsius increase due to the lower temperature increase of previous cycles. So he's saying that the result was slightly off, 1.4 to 2 point something Celsius between ambient, which was controlled in a hotbox, and the IHS. and says that was a result of the thermal resistivity of the IHS alloy having a quote hyperbolic function with temperature. So it started off slow and then picked up. As such, once it picked up with heat transfer to the CPU cores, also changed. So it's basically for the particular chip he was testing, the 4770K and potentially onward, it was a nonlinear function increase from the ambient temperature of the hot box and the IHS temperature, or the core temperature as it may be. So 40 on one did not equal 40 on the other. They were offset by 1.4 to 2.4 Celsius in this particular example. He later told me that with the more densely packed 14 nanometer chips, this might be exacerbated. So that's something to certainly keep in mind. And we have a lot of challenges to look into with Ryzen thermal benchmarking, and previously FX had some similar challenges. So it's something we're researching for Ryzen. Most of the benchmarks I've done with CPU temperature thus far, meaning non-cooler temperature, but the CPU reviews, those thermal benchmarks I tend to do within generation or within chip. So just 7700K benchmarked at different voltages, things like that. So then you're looking at just a delta, one bench to the next, rather than looking cross architecture, because for a lot of reasons that's not always easy, especially if you're relying on software measurements for the temperatures, because again, as previously, AMD, at least with FX, and we'll talk about Ryzen shortly, does not use the same temperature scale as Intel. So they're not linearly comparable. But back to the ambient stuff, VSG kind of concluded by saying, what started off as a nice trend of CPU core temps increasing linearly with ambient temps suddenly went all over the place. I imagine tighter packed dies and 14 nanometer process on AMD and Intel will be worse in this regard. So basically he was seeing something like a 40 Celsius for ambient and an IHS temperature of maybe 35.4 or 42 Celsius ambient and 37.7 IHS, something like that. So no, it's not perfectly linear. We had a pretty long conversation about it, but there's plenty more. But that's the basics. Check out Thermal Bench for more of that type of stuff. Next question is from Rayma Studios, who says, hey Steve, I was wondering if I were to remove the fan from an air cooler such as the 212 Evo or Dark Rock Pro 3, could the cooler still provide sufficient cooling to the chip relying just on the airflow generated by the case fans? I asked because some of the newer air coolers are big and chunky and look like they could dissipate a lot of heat, but the fans are loud or ruin the aesthetic of the cooler. The 212 Evo I absolutely would not remove the fan from. That is not an impressive cooler by any stretch. It's okay. And there's a reason it's like $30 or less. So no, I would not remove the fan from the 212 Evo. Depending on your CPU, of course, that is worse or better because of the lower TDP chips. It's not going to be such a problem when you're running something like a maybe 40 watt chip under the cooler. But I still wouldn't take the fan off because you could always just run it at a lower RPM. It doesn't have to be a loud fan. It doesn't fix your aesthetics problem, but you could run a lower RPM and at least just get some airflow through there, because the fins will sink the heat and they'll sit there waiting to be dissipated. So if it's not dissipating the heat, you kind of run out of room to soak the heat from the CPU. There are passive coolers though, and they are massive. Zalman made one years ago. It was some Zalman cube cooler. It looked like a Borg cube. And that, I believe, had no fan. It was a passive cooler. And I don't know if it was even anywhere remotely within spec for the socket because it was a heavy thing. So possible, yes, but you generally don't use them with overclocking K-SKU type CPUs, don't use them with higher TDP CPUs, and they need to be huge if they're going to be passive. So I would not recommend taking the fan off and just relying on the case airflow, because it's not going to be as directed, and the air pressure, by the time that air gets to the CPU cooler, the air pressure is not going to be that high, so it might as well be passive, really. Next question, Lars Passic says, hey Steve, got a question. While we all eagerly await the launch of Bikers Nexus, I've heard a surprising number of people say that there are inherent compatibility issues when mixing and matching AMD, Intel, and Nvidia components when building a PC. For example, some say that you should only go with an AMD GPU if you're going with an AMD CPU as well. Are there compatibility problems between AMD GPUs and Intel CPUs? Do Nvidia GPUs have compatibility issues with AMD CPUs? Goes on to ask more about that. Is it safe to mix and match components? I know everyone pretty much knows the answer to this, I think, on our channel, but I wanted to point it out just as a more basic question. No, it doesn't really matter. There's not going to be there shouldn't be compatibility issues between those platforms listed. What would matter is if you are trying to go with something like the dual GPU setup that AMD can do between some of their APUs and some of their lower end graphics cards. That would require, of course, an AMD APU and an AMD GPU to work. You can't use that otherwise. And that's because there's some memory unification there. And whenever you do any kind of unifying of memory, you want direct access to the memory controller on whatever CPU or APU it is. And if you're going across architecture, there's normally some latency because you can't get direct access, among other things. But that would be the only instance where it really matters. There are other things in sort of enterprise environments where NVIDIA's got their special interface for their high-end Tesla class accelerators. But that's not something we'll ever encounter when we're using PCIe. So no, it does not really, there's no inherent compatibility. Intel and AMD can't work together if you wanted an AMD GPU and an Intel motherboard or something. Next question, Justin Vistin says, any chance you guys will test if the heat pipes on motherboard VRMs actually help cool anything, or are they just there for show? Yeah, I'm interested in it. To sort of reiterate what I've said in the past, a lot of these better VRMs that have enough surface area, meaning enough phases or just good enough components in the VRM, don't necessarily need that heatsink to begin with, because VRMs, again, can sustain 125, 150 Celsius, something like that. So a lot of the time the heatsink is for show. It's hopefully still helps sink the heat. If it's got fins and contact and it's aluminum or copper or something, you're still soaking heat and hopefully still spreading it and dissipating it. And heat spread is always a good thing, well, for the most part. But that doesn't mean that they need to be cooled by passive heat sinks. It just means that it's not a bad idea. Now, you could take them off in a lot of instances if you wanted to. Again, some of these overclockers, like I was talking about with BuildZoid's comment previously, some of these overclockers just rip the heat sinks off anyway, and they don't need them on there. But as for the heat pipes and things like that, you'd assume for the most part that they work, unless there are a couple examples where on motherboards I've seen bad heatsink designs like the MSI Gain Pro Carbon, which, big surprise, the VRM heatsink there is just a giant block of aluminum and it's solid all the way through, and there's no fins. So just like if you put a 2-inch cubed block of copper or aluminum on a CPU, it would be a lot worse in that state cooling or sinking heat than if you finned it. So if you dice it into fins and you remove some of the mass, so it's actually less copper or aluminum mass, but it has more surface area because you've diced it and there are fins, that will cool a whole lot better than just a solid block of aluminum on top of a VRM, a bunch of MOSFETs. So there are definitely bad designs, but it should still sink heat better than nothing, and you still probably don't need it overall. But no, I haven't tested any specifically yet. It is something we have the capability and the tools to do, and I'm interested in it. But we've got plenty to do with the M2 Shield and all the other thermal stuff with Ryzen and everything else right now. Next question, Josh Orenberg, who's been a supporter for a long time, asks, question for the next Ask GN, what's the difference between advertised endurance, as in the warranty, and raw NAND endurance for an SSD? Should the SSD last significantly longer as indicated by raw NAND endurance, or should it only last as much as indicated in the warranty? My Samsung 850 EVO is 75 terabytes on the warranty versus 500 raw NAND endurance. For this is one I'm only bringing up, not because I know the best answer off the top of my head, but because I know the best place to get the answer. And I would prefer to point you to Tech Report for this one. So Tech Report, back when Scott was still there running the show, and when I forget the guy's name, one of his staffers at the time, I think the guy has since left, was doing a bunch of SSD NAND tests. And so they set up test benches with SSDs running non-stop for a really long time. I think it was at least a year, or at least approaching a year. So they had several disks on there. I think they had Intel, they had Samsung, absolutely. This one may have been included. And they just burned them tons of reads and writes. So they're going through the PE cycles nonstop for this whole period to see which SSDs die, when do they die, and who hangs on the longest, almost like a Survivor reality show of SSDs. So that was actually a really cool feature to follow. They did several updates on it throughout the test period and eventually wrote the conclusion, of course, which you could check out. But I would recommend going through the whole series because it's actually kind of fun to read and see which of these SSDs dies off and how do they degrade in performance, how do they start showing flaws and faults, when do the testers think that it's kind of nearing end of life for a particular SSD. I think they did a couple petabytes of write and read and write cycles on one of them. But, or I should say write and erase cycles, program erase. So that would be where I'd go for that question. I don't have the best answer, but they have a really cool content piece that I wanted to highlight because there's no point in trying to compete with that. It's probably the best one out there for endurance testing. That was done by a third-party media outlet. Next question. Bad Dragon 5 says, hey Steve, I've always wondered how rain is rendered in modern games like GTA 5 or Battlefield 1. Is it just screen space, like outside of the player's viewpoint, it's only raining in your guy's face? Or is it world space like it's raining in the world? If the former, has any game ever tried the latter? And what kind of impact on the game might we see between the two? If you do something like world space, it would be a bigger impact. This is something that we want to look into for a separate series, actually, so thank you for the idea. We'll be working on rain and weather effects in games coming up, but the short of it is that no, it's not going to be world space. It's probably rendered kind of in the frustum that your whatever your viewpoint is. But I don't have, off the top of my head, examples of games where they've tried to do world space specifically, but we will look around for the upcoming series. So subscribe for that. As always, one of the last two questions here, ML North says, your passing comment about radiators being mounted with tubes at the bottom made my 1-week-old H100i V2 pump absolutely silent, whereas before on performance setting I could hear noise. Why is this information not more widely known or accepted? I don't know. If you look around at a lot of YouTube videos, you'll see that very frequently the YouTubers mount with the tubes at the top. If you're doing a short build, whatever, I guess, doesn't matter a whole lot. But for best silence and performance and endurance, mostly silence though, yeah, mount tubes at the bottom. I'm glad it helped you. Hopefully some other folks will pick that up as well. It does matter a little bit based on manufacturer, but in general, that's kind of the rule. Tubes on the bottom because you want the pressure to be forcing the water down, not with a big air gap above the tank. Last question, Greasy Pommel says, Steve, is the wooden wall behind you real or is it a green screen? It is real. We built that wall maybe over a year ago now, maybe 2 years ago. Might be 2 years old at this point. Built it out of adhesive aged wood. So this wood is real and very expensive, unfortunately. It's like sticker wood. So we stuck it on and built a folding wooden paneled box. So this is actually two halves. I think the split's maybe right here, or it's right here actually. So if we were to pull this off, it just mounts onto the wall. There's an angled piece of wood at the top that this sockets into. So the wall itself is not screwed into the wall. It's screwed into sort of a mounting mechanism, and then that's got an angle in it, so if a cat claws on the thing, that's not going to fall down. And then the cool thing is we can pull it off the wall and fold it so it can fit through the door frames and be moved if we move studios or something. So no, it's actually real. We have a video on making it. You can search the channel, I think, for video set or GN set. There are two videos on it, and it's progressed a lot since then. So thanks for all the questions as always. If you have more for next week, post them in the comments below. And as kind of a side note, I was on the Awesome Hardware show with Paul and Kyle a couple days ago. They had some audio issues at the beginning, so skip the first 3 minutes. But after that, it was pretty good. We had a good time. That was at the AMD event, which I can say now because obviously we were all there for the Ryzen thing. And we'll have more news on Ryzen shortly, so subscribe as always. Comments below for the questions for next week. Patreon.com/GamersNexus if you'd like to help us out directly. Thanks for watching. I'll see you all next time.